All right, Doc, welcome. I Never Knew TV, right?
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Linton.
All right, cool. All right, for over 2 decades, you have over 2 decades of experience as a private physician and over 2 decades as a faculty member in higher academia, right? I just want to start off. Please let us know how you were introduced to the drug called Vioxx that changed the trajectory of your life.
Vioxx came out in the late 90s, and it was marketed very heavily, the most heavily marketed drug, which was supposed to have the advantage of being gentler on the stomach, of treating arthritis and pain and being gentler on the stomach. And I had done a research fellowship before I went into practice 20 years earlier. And it seemed that the medical journals were coming under increasing influence of the drug companies. It seemed that the medical journals were coming under increased influence of the drug companies. And this drug called Vioxx came out. An article came out in the New England Journal in November of 2000 and claimed it was safer and left docs with the impression that evidence-based medicine showed that they should use this drug to treat their patients with arthritis and for pain. It didn't, the data didn't quite look like it added up because there were 4 times as many heart attacks in the people who took Vioxx than the people who took a regular anti-inflammatory drug, an over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drug. But the article claimed that the 4-time increase in the risk of heart attack didn't achieve statistical significance, and therefore it wasn't a problem.
So the article was public information that it was increasing heart attacks?
Yep.
Was that the norm for drugs, that ratio? Was that ratio the norm for drugs at the time?
No, not at all. Not at all. But because it wasn't a statistically significant increase, the difference between the control group and the Vioxx group, they blew it off and said it had such a great benefit in not causing GI problems that this was a good drug to have. That was November 2000. Then in August of 2000, there was another article in the New England Journal, which was a review article of the class of drugs of which Vioxx was the best-selling member. And that too claimed that docs should prescribe these new drugs called COX-2 inhibitors because they're more gentle on the stomach. But there was a little bit more data in that, and it showed that if you looked at the total cardiovascular problems, heart attacks, strokes, and sudden cardiac death, that there was a problem with Vioxx. But they blew it off. They said there were only 70, or there were less than 70 cardiovascular problems, and it was too few to draw a conclusion, and they blew it off. But in that data, it showed that there were only 56 fewer GI complications, and they were making a multi-billion-dollar industry out of the 56 fewer GI complications and blowing off the cardiovascular problems that they were causing. And that's what got my attention.
All right, so you see this information. Where did the courage come from? Because you're changing your whole life at this point, right? Where did the courage come to be a whistleblower?
So I tiptoed up to it. It didn't come all at once. There was an article those 2 articles were in the New England Journal of Medicine, and there was an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association that started to look at the cardiovascular problems. It was a weak article. It made what I thought was unfair comparisons, but it did have a web address in a footnote. It had the web address into the FDA website that gave access to the data that Merck had submitted to the FDA about Vioxx. And what happened was Public Citizen had just sued the FDA to release that data, their internal reports evaluating drugs that were up for approval. So at that point, I didn't even know how to put a web address into a browser. It was 2001, but I learned how to do it to get into that website. And when I saw the data that Merck had submitted to the FDA and saw that Vioxx more than doubled the risk of heart attacks and strokes, and that the FDA knew it and that the New England Journal of Medicine should have known it, and that yet Vioxx was still the most heavily advertised drug, and people were demanding it. My patients were demanding it, that I prescribe it. And that's when I said, time out, this is not working.
So I want to make this clear. The FDA had the accurate data showing the risk of cardiovascular
Events. Yes. And not only did the FDA have it, but the FDA knew two things that were critical. The FDA knew that the New England Journal had reported it wrong. And the FDA knew that the pre-specified endpoint for the study was not heart attacks, it was total cardiovascular complications. And by just publishing the heart attacks, which were 4 times as frequent in the Vioxx group, but not including the strokes and the sudden cardiac deaths, they could claim that it wasn't that Vioxx wasn't statistically significantly more dangerous than the over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drug. But the FDA knew that both of those things were not true, didn't correct the New England Journal, and it was like a secret, and I had this secret. I felt like a little kid in a science fiction film who had turned over a rock and saw a new universe. And that's the point at which I said, I'm going to dive into this.
All right. So you said you were tiptoeing, right? What was the next step? Like, when did you get to the point to say you were going to close your practice and write a book?
So I tried to write an article for the Atlantic Monthly magazine. And they wrote back and said, we're not really interested in this because our readers already know all about this. There was no way their readers knew about that. And then Peter Jennings, may he rest in peace, from ABC News was doing a special on this. And I had written to Public Citizen to ask them why this data was sitting on the web and nobody was paying attention to it. And when they told me that they had sued to get it on the web, but I was the first person who had contacted them about it. So the Peter Jennings special contacted Public Citizen about this, and Public Citizen referred them to me. So they came up to my office, I was practicing, they came up to my office to tape an interview with me, and we spent like 4 hours taping an interview. It was the first interview I had done. And they left, and I thought about it for a few days, and I thought, gee, I didn't really do my best. It was a rookie interview. And so I got in touch with them and said, I'm not really that happy with the interview. Do you want to do it again? I'll come down to New York on my dime, and you can tape it again. They said, no, your interview's great. We're going to close the show with you. It's absolutely fine. And then the show kept getting postponed week by week. And when it finally was shown, I got cut out of it, and I was replaced by the CEO of Merck, who Peter Jennings asked the softball question, why should people take Vioxx? And his answer was, because it's gentler on the stomach and therefore a safer drug. And that's when I realized that this story wasn't going to come out through the conventional channels, and that if I wanted, that I knew something that was very important. In fact, about 50,000 people died from the cardiac consequences of Vioxx. But it's at that point that I decided that I've got this knowledge. I don't, my life is unfolded in such a way that I have this knowledge, and that I just had to tell the story.
Did you lose a lot of friends during this process?
I didn't lose friends because I had no friends in the pharmaceutical industry in the first place, but amongst my peers, they thought I was weird. And I didn't really confront them. I didn't look at them in the eye and say, look, you think you're practicing scientific-based medicine and helping your patients, but you're not, and it's irresponsible for you to continue what you do. I never did that. So I didn't. I kept my friends, and I would talk to some friends more about these things than others. But it's very hard. In the doctor's lounge, I was persona non grata for sure. because the culture of the doctors, they don't want to have to deal with what I was saying. They want to go about practicing and believing they're helping their patients as best they can by doing what doctors are supposed to do, reading the journal articles and making their clinical decisions based on the articles and the guidelines, and they're fulfilling their responsibility and their personal sense of duty by doing that. And I don't want to hear that.
I heard you once say doctors are not trained to optimize the health of the population. What do you mean when you say this?
Yeah. So doctors are trained to read and understand medical science and evolving medical science, so the articles that come out in the medical journals and the guidelines. That's their job. As they have been taught, that's how they do their job. But the fact is that 96% of medical research is about new drugs and medical devices. In other words, 96% of research is about expensive new products that will generate the maximum return on investment to investors and to the executives of the drug companies who get paid in stock options, largely paid, or they get a lot of stock options. About 60% of their remuneration is in stock options. So the doctors are taught to practice based on the results of those studies that they read in the journals. 96% of them about drugs and devices because that's where most of the money is. But the docs are taught that that's what the knowledge is, and that their job is to practice consistent with the knowledge. So when they practice, they're thinking 96% of their mental energy is about what drugs and devices to use. But the truth is that only about 20% of our health has to do with healthcare, and about 80% of health has to do with how and where we live our lives. But because 96% of the research is about drugs and devices, the docs aren't thinking about the healthy way of life of the individual patient and the healthy way of life of the community they're serving. They are following the science. The problem is that the science is epidemiologically imbalanced because the return on investment is greater when you're patenting new products and have basically no cap on the price you can charge, and that's how the money's made.
Medical schools still to this day, it seems, please correct me if I'm wrong, they don't have nutritional courses for the students.
They now do.
All right.
But they have, it's just like statistical courses. They have just enough so that the medical students can think that they understand nutrition and statistics and epidemiology. But it's like, that's like a little drizzle, and then the hurricane is the for-profit science that they're taught is the way they should practice. So there is a little bit of nutrition, and that's important that docs get even that little bit of information. But the practice of medicine is so tipped towards expensive new prescription drugs and devices that all of that gets pushed to the wayside.
Please explain to our viewers how one's race and zip code impacts the type of health care one receives in America.
One's race and zip code affects the kind of health care you have in America, but even more important, it affects the kind of health you have in America. So that poverty is definitely a health risk. There's no question. There's 3 times more likelihood that a child will grow up in poverty if they're in a black family than if they're in a white family. The deck of cards is stacked against the folks who are economically in an economically disadvantaged position in the United States. A lot of that has to do not so much with the health care that they receive, though it can, and people can be deprived of access to health care, they can be deprived of access to drugs they need for economic reasons. But the bigger part of the health problem is the inferior health of the community and the state and the nation as a whole. And African Americans get the short end of that by far. Before the pandemic hit, Americans lived 3.8 years less than the citizens of the other wealthy countries. And that despite the fact that we're spending about $2 trillion extra each year on healthcare compared to those other countries. Now it's up to $2.3 trillion difference. But after the pandemic in 2021, or not after, but 2 years into the pandemic, our deficit went from 3.8 years shorter lives to 6.3 years shorter lives. Did I say that right?
In a 2 year span?
Yeah, 2.5 years. We lost 2.5 years of our longevity. Now, we're supposed to have the best health care in the world, and we're paying about twice as much per person as the other wealthy countries are. And our longevity was 3.8 years less before the pandemic and 6.3 years less 2 years into the pandemic. But a key fact here is that that loss of years of life was not equally distributed between white people and black people. So overall, it was overall, we lost 2.5 years of life expectancy. But for white folks, it was 2 years. Jesus, I'm sorry.
No, I think we're back at it.
Okay. Okay. It's like a band that hasn't been on the road for. So overall, Americans lost 2.5 years of longevity between 2019, before the pandemic started, and 2021. But it wasn't equal for blacks and whites. For white folks, they lost 2.4 years of life. The average was 2.5 for the country. But for black folks, they lost 4 years. So what we're seeing is that your health is determined not just by your zip code, but by what country you live in. And within this country, the black folks come out on the short end of this. What does it have to do with? Some of it has to do with lesser access to health care. But there was a crucial study that was done that kind of shows the misdirection and the gross misdirection in American healthcare. Study, it was published in 2004, and it looked at the quality of care that Medicare patients received and how much money was spent, the relationship between quality and money. And what it found is exactly the opposite of what you'd expect. The states in which more money was spent on Medicare patients had the lowest quality. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida. Those states had the lowest quality medicine. And this is an incredibly important study because Medicare is a great equalizer. That takes away the economic discrimination for people over 65. They have the same insurance. So what happens? Instead of spending equal amounts of money for black folks and white folks and folks in different states, there's more money that's spent in the poorer states and a lower quality of care. And that kind of shows the lie of American medicine, that its purpose is not to make people optimally healthy most efficiently as possible. That's not its purpose. Its purpose is to harvest money out of the population. And when Medicare came in and equalized the payments, what happened is that the quality went down when people got more health care because they were covered.
A question I have is, I see a correlation between education and the healthcare system, especially in low-income areas.
Yes.
In your experience or your exposure, do lower quality doctors tend to be put or stay in low-income areas? Because that's what I noticed in education. The best teachers are not in they call it tier one, I think, like inner city neighborhoods. You know?
Yeah.
Not saying they don't have good teachers there, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think in general, there are idealistic folks of all colors and economic circumstances, and they do what they think is the right thing to do based on their principles. But I think for the most part, docs do what is predictable based on their economic opportunity. So I don't have data on the racial distribution of docs, but I do on the difference between MDs and osteopaths. So the osteopaths, and you don't hear people say, I turned down medical school because I wanted to go to osteopathic school. I haven't heard that. I'm sure there's some people who do. But basically, it's folks who don't get into medical school at that stage in their life. They go to osteopathic school, but then you can go into a residency, an MD residency, and you come out. Now, for example, the state of West Virginia started an osteopathic school because they needed rural docs. And they thought if they trained osteopaths, they'd be more likely to stay in West Virginia and treat the underserved populations in West Virginia. What happens is the docs distribute the way anyone would economically. So if they can make more money elsewhere, if they can do jobs that are better paying and less demanding.
Too, yeah.
I'm sorry?
It will have a lighter load too, right? Depending on where you are.
Yes. And paradoxically, the primary care doc has to take care of everything, whereas the specialist has intensive training and puts years into training. But once they're through with that training, they're only responsible for a narrow part of information, of having that information at their fingertips, ready to see a patient, whereas a primary care doc has to be ready for anything that walks in the door. So it's a whole lot of that responsibility that specialists don't have. I'm partial to primary care docs coming out on the short end. So I think I'm sure if you train more black folks, you'll get more doctors who take care of black folks. But you're going to lose a lot too to people who are going to distribute by their economic opportunity.
I once heard you refer to the healthcare marketing practices as sociopathic behavior, right? Is it true the majority of healthcare companies' marketing actually targets physicians and not the public?
They target whoever their marketing dollar investment will provide the greatest return for. And that's the whole spectrum. So they invest a whole lot of money in direct-to-consumer advertising. I'm sure everybody who watches television knows that. You see one or two drug ads almost in every segment of TV that you're watching. You think, how can that possibly pay off? What a stupid thing to do, to market drugs for conditions that people may have, drugs people have never heard of, and how can that possibly benefit the drug companies? Why do they throw away $6 or $8 billion a year? And the answer is they're not throwing it away. They're very good at what they do. And they know that that investment is going to return more than they put in. And it's the same with marketing to doctors. But I want to make the point, and it's really at the heart of what we're talking about, that when we talk about marketing and advertising on TV or sending pizza to doctors' offices or sending professors who are paid to lecture about a condition that a drug company is paying them to talk about for their new drug, that's one kind of marketing. But the really serious kind of marketing,
peer reviews.
The really serious kind of marketing is exactly what you're saying. It's what happens in the journals and the clinical practice guidelines. And that's supposed to be scientifically based, objective, evidence-based medicine. And yet it's not. It's devolved into marketing that the drug companies, the sponsors of the research, have enormous control over. So when a drug company does a clinical trial about a new drug that they want to get approved, or maybe it's a drug that's already out in the market and they want another indication for, when they do that, they set up a clinical trial. They set up the clinical trial. They decide who's going to be in the clinical trial and what doses are going to be used.
No third party?
No third party. No, there used to be a third party. There used to be, back in 1991, 80% of clinical trials were run by academic medical centers, and the academics were that third party. They had large control over the way studies were designed and analyzed and published. But now the academic medical centers only get 24% of the action.
Before you continue, right, what role did lobbyists play in making that shift of that role?
I don't think that was lobbyists. I think that was purely economics. The drug companies realized that they could do it more cheaply by hiring their own private research companies, and they could have control over the design of the data, the analysis of the data, and the publication of the data. We have a market failure. Market failure is when businesses are working in a profitable way, but the public does not benefit from it. The business owners, the investors profit, but the public doesn't profit. And we have market failure in medical knowledge, in what our knowledge is about, in how it's created, in how it's published, in the accuracy and completeness of the publication. And what happens is, and this is a shocking detail, and you can't understand what's going on without understanding this, that the journals are in the marketplace. They may be for-profit, they may be not for-profit. The Lancet is the prominent British medical journal. The Lancet is privately owned by Elsevier. In the United States, the two most prominent journals are the New England Journal and the Journal of the American Medical Association. They are not for profit. But the problem is that whether it's a for-profit or not for-profit journal, the journals run to maximize their financial gain. And the way they maximize their financial gain is largely to sell reprints of the articles that they publish back to the drug companies who sponsored the studies. So the drug companies can give these articles to their drug reps, and the drug reps can take them to the doctors with the pizza or whatever, and convince the doctors that the New England Journal or JAMA or the Lancet or whatever blesses this article as good science, and therefore they should follow the results. But it's a kickback deal, because in order to attract the articles that have commercial value, the journals make certain concessions to the drug makers. The biggest of those concessions is the sham of peer review. Supposedly, doctors are taught that they have to trust these articles because they've been peer reviewed by independent experts, and the articles have been shown to be true and reasonably complete in their presentation of the benefits and the harms of the drug. What the public doesn't know is that the peer reviewers don't get access to the data. The 79%, I think, of clinical trials are sponsored by drug companies, for-profit drug companies or device companies. And the drug companies and device companies own the data. When they write up the manuscript that's submitted to the journal for publication, maybe it's 10 pages or 12 pages long, all the data's not there. The data is like 3,000 pages. So they've done an extract, a severe extract of the data to make the results easily understandable.
Question. Are doctors really reading the peer reviews?
The peer review is incorporated into the manuscript that's published.
Or yeah, should I say, are doctors really reading, like really delving into the articles in the journal?
Mostly not, but it doesn't matter because the information is rarely there.
That's why I was asking, because if the information is not there, if you really analyze it like you did in your personal experience, you would see some type of contradiction in there.
The Vioxx story was a real anomaly because you could see the contradiction if you looked closely enough. But after I left my practice to write, and I wrote my first book, Overdosed America, it came out, and a week after the book came out, Vioxx was pulled from the market. It wasn't my doing. A second study, I had analyzed this first study and saw that it more than doubled the risk of heart attacks and strokes. That never quite got into the public consciousness. A second study that Merck did, set up similarly, confirmed that finding, that it doubled the risk of heart attacks and strokes. Vioxx was an anomaly because there were enough clues that something was desperately wrong in the articles so that it caused me, to reflect and to dig deeper. Most of the time, the evidence just plain isn't there. So when my first book came out, Vioxx was pulled from the market a week later, And I got catapulted onto the national stage. I was on the Today Show twice, and I did like 80 national TV shows. And whenever there was a drug problem, the TV stations, the national TV stations, cable stations would call me, and I'd go into a studio and we'd talk about it. Lawyers saw me on TV and saw that I seemed to be able to speak English and that I seemed to understand science. So they started to hire me as an expert in litigation, in these big national litigations. The first one was Vioxx. And as an expert in litigation, after signing a confidentiality agreement, I got to see the corporate hard drives. I didn't have to take anybody's word for anything. And there's a lot of money involved in these cases. So there were a whole lot of data people and junior lawyers as support staff. And I could ask the data, I could query the data with any question I wanted. I could come up with any theory and test it because I had the data. And now this is the data that doctors should have access to. This is the data that is the real science about the drugs they're prescribing for people. They don't know they don't have it, and they don't know that it really matters. So what I learned, which is what came out in the second book, Sickening, which was published in February 2022, that's the summation of what I learned after spending 10 or 15 years inside the corporate computers and what they're really doing. And there's just no way that doctors can have any idea what's going on inside those computers.
So a lot of times doctors are being criticized, but in reality, doctors are being duped and the public's being duped about medications.
That's correct. That's correct. I mean, there are times when doctors get paid off. There are times the doctors, about half of the doctors who participate in writing clinical practice guidelines are getting paid by drug companies. It's craziness. There's no reason for that. Americans deserve better, but that's the way the system works. And I think the biggest part of the problem here is that the doctors, hardworking, honorable doctors who have an honorable, moral life mission, do not understand how much they're being duped, not just by the accuracy and completeness of the data that they're getting, but even what it's about. So that their practice of medicine is which pill should I prescribe, and not that 80% of your health is determined by how and where you live your life. And we've got to address that if we're going to optimize your health.
How would a doctor respond when you tell them that? I think their ego would get involved, right? They're not open to hearing that, are they?
No, they're not. And they're not because they really can't be. They can't go into their office with the knowledge that they're being spoon-fed, selected, often inaccurate and incomplete information. They can't do it. So after I left my practice rather abruptly and got into this critical drug research, people would ask me, do I miss medicine? Do I want to go back and be a regular community doc the way I was? And I certainly miss the relationships with the people, but I couldn't go back. It's kind of like a wolf that's tasted blood. I couldn't go back because I knew that what I thought I knew is incomplete and inaccurate, and I couldn't identify what part of it was accurate and inaccurate. And I knew that the other docs didn't know. And I wouldn't know how to practice because I didn't have enough information. The practicing docs, my colleagues and friends, they can't, that is too bitter pill to swallow, to actually acknowledge that they are practicing, believing that they know things that have been presented to them for the financial benefit of the drug companies. It's just too bitter a pill. So that it's very hard for the doctors to accept this, and without the doctors understanding this, and with all the money that comes in from the lobbying, I hope we'll talk about, there's no way to change this. There's no way to change this without the doctors taking a stand, without the public taking a stand. And yet it's so hard to understand. And that's why podcasts like these are so important, because this information is so hard to get out into the public. There are so many ways that block the information from coming out.
After gaining all this information, what's your relationship with I know you're a physician, so I'm not sure if you're just taking care of yourself. But what's your relationship with medication? Like, how do you take a pill at this point with all this information? Like, how do you have to vet it yourself, or how does it work?
It's complicated. It's all different circumstances. But let me tell you a story. I had a serious, life-threatening cardiac arrhythmia. I had ventricular tachycardia. That's when the ventricle starts to beat out of control, not in a rhythmic way. The heart's normal pacemaker isn't taking over. And this started around 2014 or 15. And I had maybe 15 ambulance rides and maybe 4 or 5 ablations. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, I was at the end of the road. I was stuck in a hospital on a high dose of lidocaine, an antiarrhythmic drug, IV. And nothing was going to fix it. And fortunately, a doc who was covering for the doc who was taking care of me said, there's a procedure that can be done, and there's 2 teams in Boston that do it. And it's a procedure that comes not from the biotech labs of Boston or the high-tech places. It comes from Latin America, because people who have Chagas disease in Latin America, a bite of a kissing bug, which is a parasite in the warmer climates, the parasite attacks the heart, and it creates the kind of arrhythmia that I had. So docs from Latin America knew how to do a different kind of ablation, where one doc goes in the groin and up on the inside of the heart, and another doc goes through the chest wall, and they both have electrical probes going, and they can find the site of the aberrant beats in 3 dimensions. If you just go in the groin, you can just see it in 2 dimensions. You can't see how deep it is. But with the other probe through the chest wall, they get it. And it took 6 hours for 2 world-class docs, and they got it. And I was beat up after it happened. I mean, I couldn't talk, and I was in the ICU and really beat up. And a guy comes in, the electrophysiologists do the procedure, but I'm on the cardiology service, so they round on me and they write the orders. So a cardiologist comes in, an academic guy, maybe in his 30s, comes in and starts to tell me that I should be taking more cholesterol-lowering medication. Now, this problem had nothing to do with cholesterol lowering. It had nothing to do with cholesterol. But he came in and he starts to tell me I should be taking more of this medicine because it would lower my cholesterol and it would make me healthier. And I said, the study you're basing that on had the wrong endpoint, and it's not a valid study. And I don't think he knew who I was or what I knew, but I caught him by surprise. So he said, I can't talk about this now, but I'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk about it. So I'm still in the ICU. He pulls up a chair like a good doctor does. And as I'm looking at him, I can also look in the monitor because I'm not sure that I'm cured yet. So I've got great interest in what happens to my heartbeat as I get into a stressful situation. So he starts in again, I should be taking cholesterol, and it's in the New England Journal and blah, blah. And I looked him in the eye and I said, Doc, do you know when an article's published in the New England Journal of Medicine and it's peer reviewed, that the peer reviewers haven't seen the data? Do you know that? And he said, well, yes, I do. And I said, how can you possibly present yourself as a learned intermediary acting in your patient's benefit when you know you don't have access to the data? And I'm looking, and I'm purposely turning up the volume that I've got inside of me to look at the cardiac monitor to see if I'm really cured. And the monitor was good. And he just sort of said, like shrugged his shoulders. And that was the end of the conversation. So this is an academic guy who's going to be a major player in academic medicine as he gets a little bit older, who acknowledges that he doesn't have access to the data, and yet he's at peace with it. And I don't understand that.
Scary situation,
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but 61% of the FDA budget comes from pharmaceutical companies, right? Which seems like a huge conflict of interest. First question is, how is this legally possible?
Yeah. So it's actually 65%. So I'll correct you up, not down. And it's for drugs and devices that the FDA approves. So let's go back to how is it possible. Let's do a little, the history of it. In 1992, there were AIDS drugs in the pipeline of the FDA. And the FDA was a bit slow. And people were dying of AIDS. Every day that went by, more people died of AIDS. And there were potentially life-saving drugs, which in fact were life-saving once they got out into, through the FDA approval process and into the market. The FDA claimed that it couldn't approve drugs more quickly if it didn't have additional funds. And the way, this was President Clinton who did this, but the way President Clinton solved the problem was he provided extra funds to the FDA by having the drug companies themselves pay a user fee for filing applications and acting on applications. So this, it's called the PDUFA, which stands for Prescription Drug User Fee Agreement. So that's how it started. Now, it was a sham. They did increase the number of FDA reviewers by about 700, but they didn't add the 700 reviewers. They took the 700 reviewers away from safety, from following safety problems. So what they did is they put pedal to the metal on the approval process and they touched the brake on the safety process. So it's even worse than it appears. And as the years have gone on, the amount that the drug companies and device companies pay in these user fees has gone up and up and up. And the deadlines for approval have gotten shorter, and they've become more of, they're an issue for the reviewers because the reviewers have to meet the deadlines that are agreed to in the user fee agreement. So it really puts pressure on the FDA reviewers.
Learning a lot today. All right. Is there are there any realistic alternatives to fund the FDA without money from pharmaceutical companies?
Absolutely, 100%. It's such a stupid arrangement if our goal is to get the best medicines out to the American public as quickly and safely as possible. There's no reason for the FDA's budget to get choked by Congress so they have to take drug company money. It's all public money. The public is going to spend the money on these drugs. Congress could just fund the FDA with enough money to run independently. There's absolutely no reason for we're spending so much money on drugs. I mean, our drugs cost 3.5, our prescription brand name drugs cost 3.5 times more than the other countries do, other wealthy countries. There's no reason in the world why Congress couldn't fund the FDA so that they were completely independent of the drug companies, and the FDA could then do what we would like its job to be, which is thoroughly review the safety and efficacy of drugs. And another part of this issue is that other countries have what's called health technology assessment. So that after a drug is approved by the regulatory authorities, then another agency analyzes how much better the new drug is than older drugs and whether the new drug is worth the additional expense in terms of the benefit that the public gets. The United States was the first country to have health technology assessment, and it was the first country to get rid of health technology assessment. It was done by Newt Gingrich with his Contract for America, and in 1995 we got rid of our health technology assessment. So the job of the FDA is simply to decide on whether one or two studies have shown the drug to be significantly better than nothing and not have significant health harms. But what the public needs is not just to have the FDA review whether the drug is significantly better than nothing. What the public needs and what doctors needs is an organization or an agency that determines whether the new drug is better than the older, less expensive alternatives, and whether it should be covered by the federal government and by private insurance. We don't have that. The other wealthy countries have that.
I want to talk about Part D, Medicare drug coverage. Why is what's the origin of Medicare's inability to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical companies?
Right. It's Medicare Part D. It was passed in 2003. So there was Medicare Part A and B, and that covered hospitalization and doctor visits and hospital treatments. But prescription drugs weren't covered in that. And that's a problem because a lot of seniors couldn't afford their medicines. So there was a big push from both sides of the political aisle to get coverage for the elderly so they could afford their medicines. So the drug companies are generally against the government paying for anything. The drug companies, when Medicare initially was put into place in 1964-65, the doctors were against Medicare because they didn't want the federal government controlling their practice of medicine. Similarly, the drug companies don't want the federal government controlling their business. So what happened was, in order to get Medicare Part D passed, the chairman of the, I think it's the Commerce and Energy Committee of the House, his name was Billy Towson, commandeered this through the House. And he did it by by making it illegal for Medicare to negotiate drug prices with the drug companies. That was, we can talk about the compromises that were made in passing Obamacare as well, but the legislative process is not pretty, and oftentimes the best ideals of the legislation get cut out by financial interests. So Billy Towson marshals this plan through, and it doesn't allow negotiation. And shortly after it was passed, Billy Towson resigns his congressional seat and his chairmanship of this powerful committee, and he goes to work for none other than Pharma, the trade association for the pharmaceutical industry, for $2 million a year.
All right, so I just want to make it clear for the viewers. Whatever price is set, that's the price Medicare has to pay?
Yes.
That's wild, man.
It's wild, and it's wild especially when you think that bringing old data forward, brand name drugs cost 3.5 times as much in the United States than they do in other countries. I was just looking at the new weight loss drugs, the diabetes weight loss drugs. We charge about between 4 and 8 times more than the other countries do. But listen to this. In 2008, the median annual price of a new drug was $2,115 in 2008. In 2022, it was $257,000. 100 times more. 100 times more. Now the drugs are more complex. Easy diseases have been treated. But nonetheless, there's no cap on what the drug companies can charge. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, when the legislation says that the price of new drugs can't be raised more than the inflation rate, if you're charging $257,000 out of the blocks, you don't have to raise your drug too much to make a profit.
Listening to you speak, right? It doesn't sound like a sustainable system because I know, well, I recently had a close person who's in exam. His wife, something happened with her health insurance. He's an older guy. And he went to get his medication, and he didn't want to tell me the price. He said it's ridiculous. But who are they going to be able to sell these drugs to in the field? You know what I'm saying? Like the prices are getting so out of hand. Like, who are they going to be able to even sell these drugs to?
Well, I think the new move is going to be to socialize the high cost, the excess cost of the drugs, so that individuals won't have to pay it. For example, in the Inflation Reduction Act, part of that is that people who have Medicare Part D and bought drug coverage will not have to pay more than $2,000 out of pocket for their medications. So that sounds like a good thing on the surface, but it's just shifting the money around. So instead of the person at the cash register having to pay that money, many of whom can't pay that money, what's going to happen is Medicare is going to pay the money, and it's going to be paid for by the taxpayers. So the drug companies are very happy to socialize the payment of the drugs. They don't want the process socialized so that we've got to prove that the drugs are worth the money and doctors have the real data. They don't want that part of the socialization. But if you want to socialize the payment of the drugs, they're happy to do that.
Today, psychotropic drugs are recklessly oversubscribed and overused. How does overuse of psychotropic drugs negatively impact the collective health of this country?
That's a very important question, because psychiatry is not really a hard science like infectious disease. Infectious disease, we know there are bugs, we know what they do and how they're transmitted for the most part. With psychiatric disease, we don't really know what causes most of psychiatric disease. Much of it, there's something biochemical going on with people who have serious mental illness. But there's also a cultural, social, family context as well. And in my opinion, what we're doing is, because there's so much money to be made with the psychotropic drugs, and claims about newer drugs are better, which often are not true, that we ignore the larger context in which the person's mental health symptoms are being expressed, and just turn it into a pill. And that's destructive. It's destructive, very destructive for the patient. Sometimes people need a pill. Sometimes they're hearing voices. They're having uncontrollable mood swings. They're having a risk of becoming violent. There are real mental health problems. This is not to be denied. But to turn this into a for-profit venture means that we're going to lean too much on the medicines. And I got into some litigation about the newer antipsychotic drugs. And what I found is that often, not only were the articles that were peer-reviewed, the peer reviewers didn't have the data, but often the experts who went around to educate the health leaders in the medical communities, so the higher-ups educating the slightly lower-ups who are still higher up to most docs, they didn't have access to the data. And they often were developing giving their lectures based on slides that the drug companies had prepared. This became a real issue with the psychotropic drugs for kids, and the idea that a large population of kids had bipolar disease. This was a new disease that followed the development of supposedly better antipsychotic drugs, though it's unclear that they were better. The problem is, like we talked about before, this knowledge is knowledge with quotes around it. This knowledge is delivered by experts who haven't seen the data, to local medical leaders who haven't seen the data, to practicing physicians who haven't seen the data.
To school teachers who haven't seen the data.
Exactly, who say drug this kid because the kid can't stay in a classroom and you got to do something. Well, the kid can't stay in a classroom and it's a real problem, but the answer may not be a pill.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because most people don't acknowledge the environmental, nutrition, just nurture, spiritual aspect, or religious if you want to get into that realm. But there are a lot of factors that goes into a person's mental health, and you taking a pill can't help that.
It may help it in some circumstances,
Extreme
but it can't
circumstances,
fix it.
Can't fix it.
It can't fix it. And what we've got is this sort of magical belief in medicines, because there's such control of the information. This magical belief that a pill's going to fix this kid who can't sit in his chair and has trouble at home and There's all sorts of things going on in his life that make it impossible for him to learn the basic skills that he's going to need to be a successful adult. And to think that we can fix that with a pill is craziness. The story with the psychotropic drugs was there was a first generation of antipsychotic drugs. Thorazine was the first. It was back in the 50s. And that's when the insane asylums got largely emptied out, and you could put people on schizophrenics on drugs and they could live on the outside, supposedly, though many of them are homeless and in jail and living terrible lives. But that class of drugs had a side effect of creating muscle tremors and twitches and so forth. And that was a known side effect. So there was a second generation antipsychotic drugs that were supposed to be better than the first generation. And they were supposed to be so much better that you could now give these drugs to kids, and you can broaden the definition and lower the threshold for diagnosing bipolar disease in kids, and you could expand the indications for anxiety and social phobias and so forth. They weren't any better. It was a sham. They were no better than the older drugs. And the problem is not just that they charged a lot more for them, but it enormously broadened the market for these drugs that were supposedly safer than the older drugs, so you could prescribe them for more things than people who were hearing voices and getting violent. So this all argues back to the need. Science needs to be open. The breakthrough in science was in the 1660s, when the English physicists and chemists came up with science, the experimental method, and they formed the Royal Society of London. And they adopted the motto, nullius in verba. It's Latin, and it stands for take nobody's word for it. If you want to do science, take nobody's word for it. See the data, recreate the data, analyze the data independently before you accept something as valid science. Now that was 1660, in the beginning of the Enlightenment. We've now gone back behind those scientific standards. Our scientific standards are now lower than they were in the 1660s. Instead of the church telling us what we should believe and what science really shows, we have the investment markets telling us that. But we need some kind of reformation, like there was through the Enlightenment, to allow science to reclaim its rightful position. But that will only happen when the books are opened and people can recreate the science and recreate the statistical analysis. Before we get to that, we're going to have sham after sham, like the second generation antipsychotics are better than the first generation antipsychotics.
What are your thoughts about ADHD and ADHD medication?
Same issue. I've known kids that their brain won't allow them to be able to organize their life, to have the potential to grow up to be successful adults. It's a real thing, and it's a bad thing. And if you can treat those kids so that they can focus and function and be a normal kid and have normal friends and develop a sense of intrinsic worth, and if a pill will help the kid do that, and it couldn't otherwise be accomplished by changing the context that they're in, the family context, school context, community context, then it may be the right thing to do for some kids. But it's not the right thing to do for whatever percentage of kids we now have on these drugs. You got to change. Kids are just bundles of energy, and you got to figure out how to harness that energy so they can have fun and be energetically who they really are while they're achieving the goals of their education and forming citizenship and participating in social activities and religious activities and so forth. But if a kid can't do that, the window closes and they can be forever stuck as outsiders in society. not in a good way, not in a way that they're comfortable with. And so as a family doc, I would see that, and I would refer those kids who looked like they were going to get locked out of a good life because they couldn't, because their executive function, they didn't have control of their executive function.
My personal experience is that outside of my chiropractor, when I do go to the doctor, I probably talk to him for about 3 to 5 minutes. Like it's like in and out, right? How long should a physician be with a patient to get a clear understanding of what's going on as a primary care doctor?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are really two kinds of answers. One is that you need to have a block of time. I don't know if it's 40 minutes or 60 minutes. You need a block of time once a year to discuss how your health is, what your life is about, what you're concerned about, if you're meeting your goals, not meeting your goals, why aren't you meeting your goals, and so forth. So I think you need to have that block of time once a year. And then sometimes visits are very quick. Doc, I got a sore throat and my gland here hurts, and they've got yellow stuff on their tonsils, and you do a strep test and it's positive, and you write them a prescription and they're done, not complicated. Sometimes it's really complicated, and what they're presenting is just the tip of the iceberg. Doc, I had a headache, and it turns out they're in some terrible marital crisis, or I had a young guy, I think God was looking over me, a young guy who happened to be the child of a well-known professional athlete, came in and had a headache, and there was something about his headache wasn't right. And we spent a little time, and I sent him right off to the neurologist, and he had a brain tumor that was, it's a tumor in his sinus that was just about to go into his brain. So he needed a little more time, and then I had to do the handoff. But the point I want to make is that it varies, but with a good primary care relationship, the conversation keeps going. So it may be a 3-minute visit one time and a 40-minute visit another time, but I know you as a person. I know the things that you're worried about. I know your health vulnerabilities. And you might not have been in for 6 months, and I might say to you, how was your daughter's wedding? Were you able to go? So the conversation just keeps on going. So it's not so much time per visit. It's the quality of the relationship that you can have over time, and whether the doc is spending enough time on that visit to address the complaint you have that day.
And the reason I asked the question, I just wanted to know, are doctors under pressure from insurance companies to see a lot of patients in the day? Because it seems like everything is sped up now. Because when I went to the doctor when I was younger, that's the experience that I had. But now it's just like, even for my 1-year visit, I don't know if I have a good doctor or not, but it's very short.
Yeah. Yes, things have changed, and the computers have changed it. Because you may be spending time with your doctor, but your doctor's eyeballs may be in the computer, and he's just figuring out which box to check. He's not hearing your story, and certainly not, it's not a soul-to-soul encounter.
Interaction.
I'm sorry?
It's not that human interaction.
It's not the human interaction, which is that's the core of the whole thing. But it has changed. Managed care changed it. The acquisition of doctors' practices by larger organizations changed it. And now we've got venture capital companies buying up dermatology and ophthalmology and emergency room practices.
Makes sense. So that's what happened now. So you had someone who had a private practice. That's now he's with these kind of co-op things going on now.
Exactly. Right. So the either the health system that he's in for primary care docs, or the venture capital companies, literally they're buying dermatology practices and emergency room and anesthesia practices, and their job is to make as much money as they can. There's no other way to say it. And we've got to understand, we live in a capitalist country. I don't know a better way to organize an economy, but that we are a capitalist country means that much of our economic activity is, the goal of it is to maximize the amount of profit that's turned over to the private equity investors, not to provide the social good that most of us who decide to go into medicine think we're going to be able to adhere to, that principle. how are we going to get to optimal health? Our bodies are finite. They're going to run down. We're going to get sick. We'll get better. We'll live, if we're lucky, to be 85, 90 years old. Most of our health and most of the quality of our life is not the medical care that we get, but it's how we live our lives. Some of this we have control over, and some of this we don't have control over. If we're living in a rough neighborhood, it's hard to get exercise. It's hard to go for a run or a walk. If we're in a food desert, a good food desert, it's hard to get good nutrition. So some of this is just public and out of our individual control. It's a community and state and national issue. But it's the whole palette of behavior that determines our health. And nutrition is definitely on that palette. And stress is definitely on that palette. And I personally believe that a sense of purpose, a moral compass, is on that palette. And that some kind of spiritual practice or experience is on that palette. And enough sleep is on that palette. And it's the whole palette. And each of us lives a unique life. And our palette is different. How to balance those things on our palette is the challenge. And I think to do that, we need to take individual responsibility. There's no magic health out there. We can't take a pill. You can't take a cholesterol-lowering drug and say, okay, it doesn't matter if I exercise, it doesn't matter if I smoke, it doesn't matter if I eat processed meat because I took a pill. You can't do that. You've got to be responsible for your health. And your doctor, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, has to be your partner in helping you during that long visit once a year. The job of that visit, besides taking care of particular illnesses or conditions that need attention, is to look at that palette that makes up your life and to help you identify where you need modification, and very importantly, to help you make changes, to follow you over time. So many doctors believe that suggesting to a patient that they exercise regularly is a waste of time because they won't do it. But I know as a primary care physician, and I know from real scientific study, that people do change. They don't change with one visit. So when I would make a recommendation, somebody's pre-diabetic, hypertensive, whatever, they're at risk of serious health problems, and I make a recommendation that they adopt healthy lifestyle changes, which have to do with nutrition and exercise and stress. And I would make another visit for a recheck for a month later, I would know that 95% of the folks wouldn't have made a change. They weren't able to make that change because just because I recommended it. But they would be one step closer to making that change because they would come in and tell me why they couldn't make that change. And we're not going to get to the goal without finding out why they can't make the change. It may be simply operational, they need a babysitter, they need childcare or something. It may be inertial, it may be that they're rebelling against a parental voice. Whatever it is, it can be anything. But you move down the spectrum of the truth of that person to getting to the point where they can make a change and they can sustain that change. But docs say, I don't waste my time doing that because I know they won't do it. Well, they won't do it if you just say it once and say goodbye, I'll see you in a year. We've got to understand that we all have made a kind of stable self for ourselves, trying to find meaning in the world. And to make changes in that self, you've got to do some rearranging. You just can't move one thing and expect to make a permanent change. And I think that's the core of primary care. And to go back to your earlier question, sometimes that issue takes an hour to address, and sometimes it takes 3 minutes to address. We are a capitalist society. I don't know a better organization for a society than a capitalist society. But we've got to be realistic that there are tendencies and limitations within the capitalist society that disserve the public good. We've got to know that. So a drug company's job is to make money. Let's be honest about it. It's not an accusation. I'm not accusing them of being greedy. That would be like accusing a leopard of having spots. It's what they are. Their job as an entity is to make money. Now, we know that. That's why we need a government in a capitalist society and not just companies to rule our country. A government must put guardrails on economic activity so that companies can thrive, but they can only thrive by having a positive social effect. And in our healthcare system, we now have a system with very few guardrails, radically fewer guardrails than the other wealthy countries have. And the consequence is that 1.1 million Americans die every year in excess of the death rates in the other wealthy countries. 3,000 Americans die every day. We have a 9/11 tragedy every day because our health and healthcare are so far inferior to the other wealthy countries. And at the same time that we have 1.1 million Americans dying in excess every year, we're spending $2.3 trillion more, not $2.3 trillion total. We're spending $2.3 trillion in excess of what the other countries are spending based on their per capita costs.
I just want to ask you, man, I'm pretty sure you've been to a lot of countries, right? Is America just, put the healthcare system to the side, is America just an unhealthy country in regards to our approach to work, our mental health, and our eating habits? It just seems like people don't do well in America collectively, health-wise, compared to other countries.
That's correct.
With less resources.
That's correct. We have more chronic disease. We have fewer healthy years. We have obesity. Our obesity rate is now 42% of American adults are obese. That's like twice as the rate of the other wealthy countries. And there are a number of reasons for it, but I think the primary reason, the primary source of this problem, I think, is the maldistribution of wealth. So that the maldistribution of wealth, the inequality of wealth in the United States, is now as much as it was during the gilded years of the early 1900s, the roaring 20s. After World War II, we became quite an egalitarian country. The profits that were made by the corporations were distributed equally amongst all segments of society. So working people benefited and the wealthy benefited almost to the same extent. But since 1980, we have become radically unequal and radically different from the other wealthy countries. And I think I think that's the kind of linchpin of the whole problem, because then we have money in politics, and we allow more money freely into politics, and we get into lobbying and influencing our legislators, and it's a bipartisan project. Democrats get about as much money as Republicans do. It's not like there's one party that owns integrity on this problem. And again, we need guardrails, but we're not going to get those guardrails. They're not going to come magically from the sky. The only way we're going to get those guardrails is if citizens become activists and demand that their government support a healthy way of life and protect them from the excesses of the capitalist market. We want to get the benefit of capitalist ingenuity and innovation, but we want to be protected from the excesses so that our lives are built around a soulful, healthy existence, not to be like an ant in an ant colony that's going to produce the most benefit from the owners or colonizers of our society.
Can you speak about the guidelines doctors have to use? And can you also tell us if that's a healthy practice in the industry?
Yeah. So in an ideal healthcare system, there would be clinical practice guidelines that would take all of the information and assess all of the information and then make recommendations to doctors about how to treat which conditions at what thresholds. And that would be a good thing, to get standardized information to all docs. That's not the system we have right now. We have guidelines, and the guidelines really have to be followed because they're at the apex of evidence-based medicine, but they're also, they can also be used in malpractice litigation if you don't follow the guidelines and you're presumed to be in violation or have not practiced according to community standards if you haven't practiced according to the guidelines. The problem is that the guidelines are only a compendium of the articles that are published in the medical journals. So the articles in the medical journals are largely sponsored by the commercial entities, drug companies, device companies. The peer review is not a real peer review. The peer reviewers don't get the data. They can't analyze the study independently. And then the journal publishes it, and those articles then get put together by experts into clinical practice guidelines. Problem is that many of the authors of these clinical practice guidelines are getting paid by the drug companies. And in fact, a majority of the chair and vice chair of these expert panels are getting paid by the drug companies. So the Institute of Medicine, which is not financially based, is an independent organization, now called the National Academy of Medicine, started to look at these guidelines and make recommendations for ways to make them better, like not let the chair or the vice chair have financial ties to the drug companies, have a minimum number of the experts who are on the panels have financial ties to the drug companies. So the government did a good job in making a national clearinghouse for guidelines. The Agency for Healthcare Quality Research did a great job. They created a great website. They posted all the guidelines, and this started in 2017. In 2018, this agency got the idea that they ought to use the Institute of Medicine's criteria for what guidelines should follow, and that this agency would put a note at the top of each guideline to inform readers of the guidelines whether these guidelines were trustworthy or not, according to the independent criteria of the National Academy of Medicine. Great idea. That website got zero funded and canceled shortly after it adopted the requirement that there be a comment about how trustworthy that guideline is. It got canceled. And that was a way to inform doctors that they were getting biased guidelines, and when they read the guidelines, which are the best they had, that they should be cautious about implementing the recommendations. That was cut out. Cut out. I got in touch with this happened when I was writing Sickening, my last book. So I got in touch, an organization at another university, I won't mention the name of it because it's not important, took over the function. And I called the new director of this project that was now going to be housed in a university instead of the government, and said to him or her that this was essential information that doctors needed, and was she going to continue it? I guess it's a she. Was she going to continue it? And that was the last we communicated. So this tool that would have been very helpful for doctors to understand the limits of the guidelines that they have to practice by just got washed away by government zero funding it.
So you've uncovered a lot about the medical industry, right? And you've seen the greed and evils of man. How has that influenced your view of mankind or humans?
Yeah. I think we humans have a flaw. I think that in order to live in groups, initially hunter-gatherer groups and then larger societies, we need to be able to accept a common view of reality. so that we can interact based on that. And I think we've got a weakness built in to accept as knowledge, the culture that we're in and the cultural memes, I guess is the best word. And now with technology being so advanced and being so quick to produce so-called knowledge that becomes commonly accepted, that we're now vulnerable to being abused by the producers of this knowledge. And this is where we are, and being on the cusp of artificial intelligence is going to put this whole problem on steroids. But what we're weak at is critical thinking. And I think in this complex world, with a lot of information coming and expert information not necessarily being free of conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest, we've got to be critical thinkers to protect ourselves and our families from the excesses of the society. And the need for that grows and grows and grows. But unfortunately, the invasiveness of misinformation and destructive information grows faster than our ability to become critical thinkers. And I think this is the issue that's going to determine how we go as a species in the next 10, 50, 100 years. And it's really hard because the press now is largely influenced, not totally influenced, but largely influenced by these economic pressures. And so where can people get their information that they can trust? This is a critical, it may be an existential issue. And I think that it's people like you who can bring honest information to the public that are necessary. It's like the oxygen we need to get our brains straightened out so that we can understand what a good life is and then how to organize together so we can achieve a good life for everybody.
I want to jump back to the critical thinking, and the question I have for you is that even when presented with quality, truthful information, can people process that information?
It's very hard for people to process that information alone. Everyone's part of a community. And when I give a talk to lay people, not doctors, and they say, what can I do? My first response is, talk to your friends, talk to your families, talk about these things. Make talking about these things normal, okay. It's abnormal. It's abnormal for me to come into a room of doctors and say there's a 1.1 million excess American deaths a year, and for that we're wasting $2.3 trillion a year. That's abnormal. That's not polite conversation. But we've got to be comfortable with our own, have the confidence to gain the information and then to share the information. But start with the people immediately around you. You don't have to go on TV with information you're not sure. Just start the conversation. Hey, our healthcare is really messed up. I had no idea how messed up it is. Talk to people. Once you start to talk and look at it, you're going to see some stuff in the news. I'm going to make a shameless plug for my book. If you can't afford the book, get in touch with me. I'll send you a PDF. But you gotta read these sources that aren't normal in the sense of with the program, with the cultural program, the normative cultural program, but they're responsible. Now, it's not easy to decide who's not normal, but who is responsible. But that decision you've got to make. But make the decision and just start talking about what it is that's preventing our family and our community and our people from living better lives, from not having to work 60 hours a week, from not having both parents out of the house working just so we can have a decent life for our kids and maybe get our kids to reach their potential. We're in a tough place right now, but we got to start talking. And the other thing is, please don't be distracted by the polarization in Washington. The right and the left are so busy arguing with each other, they forget that there's a huge common area, and we ought to be talking about building the common area, not fighting about the fringes of what we believe. We've got to do that. And it's the same in medicine. We've got to be talking among the doctors and the nurses and the patients, and everybody's got to be talking about what's the common space that's going to straighten this out. And it's only by establishing that common space that we're going to become powerful enough to reclaim the purpose of all this activity in human terms instead of economic terms.
What are your thoughts about AI replacing low-skilled jobs? It's already happened a lot. We don't have the robot there, so a lot of jobs have been replaced through technology.
Yeah.
But even more jobs, I guess, that needs a little human labor.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a real risk. I mean, it's really a redux of the globalization of the economy. When we shipped low-skilled jobs that Americans were doing off to less wealthy countries, so that we could pay those laborers less money and they had less environmental regulation. So American workers got hurt by that. And that, I think that's part of what's created the political turmoil now, because people are angry that they're not living the lives they thought they were going to live. And that anger may take a right-wing turn, it may take a left-wing turn, but the anger isn't going to help. So I think it's a real risk, but I think a bigger risk is that it's going to take high-skilled jobs. I just saw an article just this morning, an article that just came out that compared artificial intelligence to a doctor diagnosing different conditions. And the AI did better for some things and not as well for other things. But there's a huge risk that we're going to just turn over responsibility for our thinking to AI, when I know the question you raised before about how long should a primary care visit be. A primary care visit should be long enough to deal with what you got medically and to touch somebody's soul. And AI may pretend to do that, but it's not going to do it. And I think we've got to really protect ourselves, whether it's through the church, through critical thinking in an academic way, whatever it is that gets you to your core, we've got to protect that core and the core of the community. This is a real risk. I'm not an expert in this, but it's a real risk.